So in this second part of our qualitative methods lecture, we'll discuss the different methods that exist for analyzing qualitative data. We will not be discussing them in much detail because, first of all, each method probably requires a fairly long time to get a hand on, and basically you learn it by actually working with your material. So don't be afraid if you don't understand how to deal with it. Just open a chapter where this method is described and try to follow the examples and apply the same procedure to your own material. What kind of qualitative methods exist in psychological literature? Basically, if you open a textbook saying qualitative methods in psychology, you'll typically find a whole bunch of chapters, each chapter devoted to a specific method. And this is a kind of a laundry list of methods that you can find in most common textbooks. However, when you explore those textbooks, just be aware that the field of qualitative methods is relatively new. And it is only by the end of 1990s that more or less standardized understanding of these terms has emerged. For example, what is thematic analysis or interpretive phenomenological analysis? If you open chapters written by different authors, and especially during the early years of development of qualitative methodology, you can actually find that the same name is applied by different authors to slightly different procedures. A description of phenomenological analysis by Smith and Osborne might not be the same as the description that you can find in the book by Natalia Busygina or by other authors. But this is perfectly okay. All these descriptions are completely valid, and basically the right way to deal with this is just to choose one source, just to choose a particular recipe provided by a particular methodologist, and just stick to this recipe in your analysis. So when you say, I conducted my IPA based on Smith and Osborne, there will be no questions because everyone will understand what kind of steps you followed, because these steps have been described and published somewhere. And we'll just explore some of the most handy methods that are most likely to be useful for you. But then again, don't be afraid to explore the other ones. What are the methods that we use most frequently in psychology, in psychological literature? These are so-called methods for analyzing meaning, or we can call them jointly this way, because all these methods, they start with a text, and their goal is actually to extract from this text some meanings, to extract from this text its content, and present its content in a more accessible and concise form. But there is a difference between these methods in how deep they go in this analysis. And we can arrange them in a sequence from the deepest analysis on the left, which is descriptive phenomenological analysis, to quantitative content analysis on the right, which is very much a surface analysis. It mainly deals with form. So what is the difference? When we say content analysis, we typically think of methods that have been developed mainly by sociologists, and the goal is to extract the content by counting certain words or expressions or certain themes in the text. In content analysis, we typically start by a text, which can be sometimes an interview, but most often it's a series of answers to open-ended questions, very concise, provided by different individuals. And then we come up with a coding scheme, and either we count certain words or we classify those answers into certain groups. But the result of our analysis is typically expressed in a quantitative form. So for example, I could ask people how you're feeling right now, collect open-ended answers, and then I could classify them into positive and negative emotions. and just count the number of times each person mentions a positive emotion or a negative emotion in their open-ended answer. And then the result of my analysis will be basically a matrix that I could use in SPSS or R or anywhere. But these methods, they work with surface. They are optimal for situations where it's fairly easy to understand what we want to extract when the categories of our analysis are expressed in specific words. Sometimes, however, we are not quite sure how do individuals describe and name those psychological processes that we are interested in. Sometimes we don't know exactly what kind of questions do we need to ask. And in these situations, we use deeper methods, phenomenological analysis methods. In phenomenological analytic methods, your result is not quantitative at all. Your result is a qualitative text description, but a description that presents in a more concise form the material that you're interested in, and a description that makes evident what kind of phenomena, what kind of processes are described and reflected in those texts. And there are different varieties of phenomenological analysis as well, a more descriptive approach and a more interpretative approach. And we'll talk about the difference between them very shortly. And the term thematic analysis can be applied to different methods. So sometimes some people call a variety of APA thematic analysis. Some people apply this to content analysis. So if you see the word thematic analysis without reference to a source, be very careful because it might be very loose as a method. So first of all, let's take a quick look at descriptive phenomenological analysis. What is descriptive phenomenological analysis? It's a method where your source data is basically any text, and your result, the result of your analysis, is also a text, but a more concise one that clarifies the phenomena reflected in this text. So this method does not give you tools to generalize. If you want to generalize over different individuals, it will be quite challenging if you use descriptive phenomenological analysis. But if you're doing a case study and your goal is understanding a specific person, a specific situation, then this method might be optimal. What are the steps of descriptive phenomenological analysis? These are the steps described by Amedeo Giorgi and Barbara Giorgi, American methodologists. And descriptive phenomenological analysis is basically the same phenomenological approach described by Husserl and Heidegger, where there are 4 classical steps. The first step is just getting a general impression. You look at the text, you try to read it or scan it and just get an idea of how it feels, what it tells you about. And this general impression, you don't have to record it anywhere, but it guides your following work with this text. So just the same thing if you used some projective methods. If your participant has drawn some drawing, first you look at this drawing and you try to feel your emotional reaction, your impression, which then guides your understanding. It's the same phenomenological approach. The second step is deconstruction. When you split this text into little fragments, so that each fragment only tells you about one thing, only describes a single phenomena. And again, there is no right way to split the text into fragments. Different authors, different analysts might use different fragments. Some people may create larger chunks. Some people prefer smaller chunks, so it's up to you. And then the third step is a reconstruction. After you have split the text into fragments, you try to reformulate the phenomena that are expressed in each fragment to make them more explicit, and also in the process to move from an everyday language to a psychological language, to explain this phenomena in terms that will be more easy to understand. So, for example, if a participant says, "I felt like crap," you need to reformulate it in some way. For example, the participant experienced a negative emotion, or maybe based on your talk with this participant, you know what this negative emotion is, and then you can say a participant expressed certain emotions if it follows later on in the text. So your goal is to explicate and to present what you understood, and some of these might be actually your intuitions about the content of this text. But in going to this level of intuition, you need to be very careful and to verify whether your intuition is coherent with this text. And then at the end, you generalize the text into a concise and very brief description. So just to give you an example of what it looks like, this comes from the work by Amedeo Giorgi and Barbara Giorgi. And here they present the three steps 2, 3, and 4, in fact, on a single worksheet. In principle, you can use different papers for these steps of this analysis. You don't have to present it in this way. But the logic is that you do those two steps. So in this particular example, they were conducting an interview with people who tried to learn something, but it was very challenging and they failed. And they tried to understand how it goes. And here, participant 1 describes, "I learned how to copy a key a few days before I had to make one. Now a customer came who requested several copies of a round key. He was waiting. The person that usually cut the keys was not available, so I had to do it." And then the second step, after you read through this text, the second step is to split it into fragments and explain what happens in each fragment. So for the first fragment, "I learned how to copy a key several days before I actually had to make one." You say participant 1 states that he had apparently acquired a certain skill several days before he actually had to produce a product that required the skill. And then the second fragment, "A customer had requested several copies of a round key. He was waiting. The person that usually cut the keys was not available, so I had to do it." And you explicated. Participant states that he had to exercise the recently acquired skill on his own, and participant reluctantly recognized that he had to do it. And then as the third step, you try to come up with a more summary description. And you say participant found himself in a situation where he had to execute a recently acquired skill in a real situation, and it was clearly among his first attempts, and participant feels the pressure. And this third step can be actually the basis for your final qualitative description. And your qualitative thick description, it can not only include your summary, but it can also include quotations from your participants' responses that allow to understand better the context. So you can find more examples in the chapters by Giorgi and Giorgi. I will just say that this method is good when you don't have too much textual material and when you're interested in this particular text. You don't really want to generalize across different individuals, because otherwise it will become very, very tedious. As you can see, actually working with a small text fragment can take you a couple of hours. So this method is really, really work intensive, but then it is also very productive in terms of allowing to really understand what's going on. Another method, which is probably more handy because it gives us some tools, some approaches to generalize over the material, is called interpretative phenomenological analysis. What is the difference? In descriptive phenomenological analysis, we just focus on describing. In interpretative phenomenological analysis, we want to understand and generalize and represent. So in contrast to descriptive phenomenological analysis, IPA is the method that is most often used in research. So I would say probably 80% of qualitative studies use some variety of IPA or thematic analysis, which is very close, but which can also be sometimes called IPA by some authors. So here, basically, your logic is that you come up first with a research question. You create then a schedule of interview that allows you to focus on this research question. And this interview has to be structured in a certain way. It has to follow a certain logic. The first questions typically are used to better understand the context, how a person feels in general, what kind of experience a person has had with this particular situation. And then the following blocks of questions can be focused on more specific aspects of this experience that you're interested in. And then you conduct your interviews following this schedule. Of course, this is semi-structured interview, so you have an approximate list of questions that you want to ask. But if in the process you discover that there is something else that comes up that is particularly interesting, you can also ask additional questions, asking a person to elaborate on this. Could you tell me more about this, or how this felt for you, and so on. After you conduct all these interviews, when you finished conducting all the interviews, you transcribe them, and then you start analyzing. You go through each interview, and you try to identify and group the fragments that describe a certain theme. So your goal is not to rewrite this text, but to formulate the contents that are presented in this text in form of themes. And then you gather those themes from each participant, then you gather them from all participants, and then you use this whole bunch of themes to come up with a narrative that describes how people have lived through this situation. Then again, I will not go into details with this example, but you can find a very good example in a chapter by Smith and Osborne, in the textbook by Smith, Qualitative Research in Psychology, Qualitative Psychology. And there they explored how do kidney patients respond to illness, how this experience of illness has affected their identity. And this interview, it starts with more general questions about dialysis. Could you give me a brief history of your kidney problem? Could you describe what happens, how you experience it, and so on? And then the following questions, they focus on how this illness has affected your sense of self, and so on. And your interview transcript, it is actually usually quite lousy because participants talk in different ways. And here is just an example that shows basically what this text can look like. Since it started getting bad, I was always snappy with it, but not like this. It's not who I am. It's just who I am, if you know what I mean. It's not really me. I get like that, and I know like you're being mean now, but I can't help it. It's the pain, it's me, but it's me doing it, but not me. Do you understand what I'm saying? And you think, oh my gosh, what is it? But based on their experience of talking to this person, the interviewer, the researcher can actually try to extract those themes. So I was getting snappy with it. It's aggression or irritation. It's not who I am. It's a sense of de-identification or some issues with identity, and so on. So basically, first you try to jot down on the other part of this sheet a rough draft list of themes that you see in this. And this is the first step that you go through. Actually, in this process, you can do it manually, just by having Word files, or you can use some kind of software. Software like NVivo or software like MaxQDA. There are different software packages that can be used for qualitative methods that allow you to actually store this list of themes and connect themes to fragments in the text so that you can click on a theme and then see straight away all the examples from all the participants where this theme was found. And then it makes it very easy to actually improve and correct your analysis. Of course, if you have just a small number of interviews, this is totally fine to analyze by hand. But as soon as your number of interviews becomes large, more than 7 plus minus 2, it becomes extremely hard to remember all the cases when a person has told you about a certain theme. So then using a software package might be actually a good idea. And then again, these software packages don't make this analysis automatic. They just provide you with an interface to store the themes that you have extracted and to improve your coding by seeing these texts all together more easily. So the first step is jotting down an initial list of themes, and then you come up with a clean list of themes for every participant. And then you generalize those themes over different participants, and you come up with a master list of themes for the group. Typically, in an ideal situation, all those themes can be found in the interviews of all the participants, but not necessarily. There might be some individual differences. So depending on whether you want to focus a little bit on describing those differences, or if you just want to generalize, then you try to look only for themes that are common across all interviews. Then again, you can tune your analysis the way you need it. And then you use this table of themes in order to write down a textual narrative to explain how participants perceive it. So you don't count the number of occurrences of those themes, for example. It makes no sense. So this is interpretative phenomenological analysis that is most often used if you want to understand how people in general from a certain group perceive a certain situation. Just briefly, we can take a look at some other methods. Thematic analysis. It's very close to IPA. Some people actually use the terms sometimes jointly, but here in this description I will base it on work by Brown and Clark, two British researchers, and the version of this method that they present is actually very similar to descriptive and interpretative phenomenological analysis. First, you familiarize yourself with the data, you read and reread, you try to maybe note down your initial ideas, then you generate your initial codes, then you reformulate those codes into themes, then you give those themes your final names, and you come up with a report. So essentially it's very similar, as you can see, and the difference from IPA is that they propose to present this report in terms of a tree of themes. So in their article that you can find in our materials, you can find an example of a study of how women perceive their vaginas, and here basically they show what kind of categories they came up with, and they provide also a checklist of criteria that you need to be aware of to make sure that your analysis is good. So essentially, thematic analysis can be thought of as a slightly lighter version of interpretative phenomenological analysis. So if you're thinking of conducting IPA, but maybe you want to be less strict in the way you extract those themes, thematic analysis is a nice choice. It's more accessible, it's more simple from my experience. But potentially, maybe it's also a little bit less rigorous. And in the end, there is not much difference between thematic analysis and IPA. Finally, the last most handy method is content analysis, which we use to extract some content from a large body of material. A large number of open-ended answers provided by participants. So, for example, in our studies, when we included open-ended answers, open-ended questions into questionnaires online, sometimes we got 2,000 responses. And then it's not possible absolutely to go in depth. It's not possible to use any kind of descriptive or interpretive phenomenological analysis. The best you can do is just to try and count the number of occurrences of different words or different themes. And essentially, this is what is called jointly content analysis. I will not talk about quantitative content analysis, when basically you take some kind of software package and it counts the number of times a certain word is present in your text. This is very straightforward, and it's not even a qualitative method. Qualitative content analysis is a situation when it's not readily evident what kind of words or what kind of themes do you want to extract, and what kind of criteria you want to use to be sure that this theme is present here or not. So normally when we do this study, first we start by developing an initial list of themes. And this initial list of themes can come up either from theory or it can come from our material. For example, recently with my graduate student Polina Yegorova, we explored what do teenagers and adults daydream about. And we basically asked open-ended questions like I dream about, and people had to complete the sentence. And then we tried to group those answers into groups. So first we tried to group them based on our initial intuition. Okay, this is about relationships. I dream about having a nice family. Or this is about work. I dream about building a career. But then you start coding. You start classifying the responses into those groups. And during this initial work, first you refine your coding criteria, because sometimes there are problematic aspects. For example, I dream that my favorite singer will come to my city and give a concert. And is this about relationship, or is this about entertainment, or is it about something else? And it's up to you to make this decision. And it's up to you to discuss this decision if you have a partner who also does the coding. But finally, you need to be very clear about why did you decide to classify this in this way, and what are the criteria that you used for each theme. And there are different ways you can classify. Sometimes you just sort your answers if they are very short, and if there is only one theme that is expressed in every answer, you can basically sort them into groups, and then you'll have a nominal scale. Or sometimes if an answer is a little bit longer and it might include some themes, you can just have a table where for every answer you will have a list of columns, and for every theme you can place 1 if it's present in this answer, or 0 if it's not present in this answer, and then it will be a number of binary scales, and your result is going to be quantitative. You can analyze this result using some kind of software packages. For example, in SPSS you can do cluster analysis or some kind of other dimension reduction technique to come up with more general structure, or you can correlate those categories with the results of some quantitative methods. So there is a lot that you can do. And also, because the result is quantitative, you can also check the reliability of coding. Of course, if you're just doing a master's dissertation, it's not essential. But if you want to publish your results, typically reviewers will ask you, is your coding reliable? And what it means? It means that you have a very clear coding schema. Why do you ascribe certain categories to certain answers? And a person who is not you, but who is familiar with this schema, is able to also produce the codes that are in good agreement with your codes. And we use some kind of measure of expert agreement. The easiest version is some kind of correlation, but there are also intra-class correlations and different Cohen's kappa and so on, so different measures of expert agreement. And if you're interested in this, there is a paper on expert agreement in our course materials that I referred to in some previous lectures. So a person who you don't have to have actually several coders. Maybe it's enough to have just a single coder, but you need to demonstrate that on a small subsample of your answers, an independent coder produces codes that are consistent. If your coding schema does not allow you to produce consistent codes, for example, you formulated your criteria in such a way that different people understand them in different ways, you need to come back and refine this criteria and recode those texts, and this is why it can become actually quite tedious. Another approach could be to use several experts. Maybe it's very hard to explicate exactly what are the criteria for a specific rating. For example, in one study by Peter Ebersol, he asked his participants to describe a situation when they experienced a meaning in life. And participants provided little essays, and then experts had to code those essays. Is this meaning deep or superficial? And there are some criteria, but of course they cannot be completely perfect because the meanings are very individual. But you can use several experts, and then you can average across those experts, and you can arrive at a much more reliable result. So your goal is to have a reliable result and to prove this reliability. So this is essentially qualitative content analysis. And then again, there are different strategies that you can use. Sometimes you generate those categories based on your texts. Sometimes you generate those categories based on theory. Sometimes you generate based on theory, but then you refine during your work with the text. So basically all of these approaches are good enough. And in a paper by Xia and Shannon, you can find a description of different types of content analysis that you can use to justify your analysis. So it can be based on theory, why not? Then just call it directed content analysis, and you'll be fine with your reviewers. So these first 4 methods are probably the most handy to use in psychology. There are also some other methods that we use occasionally. I will not say much about them, but if you're interested, you might easily find chapters in the textbooks. Critical discourse analysis, or Foucauldian discourse analysis. It's on the one hand, it's very similar to phenomenological analysis, but on the other hand, it's completely different. Phenomenological analysis is about being completely open to your participant and trying to see the world through their eyes. Critical discourse analysis, it is the art of suspicion, as Potter, one of the authors of this method, called it. Your goal is not to trust whatever a person is telling you, but your goal is to be suspicious and try to understand what are the underpinnings of these words, what are the assumptions behind these words, how does this person see the world, and what kind of power relationships is she or he trying to establish. And you also analyze the way these relationships are reflected in the texts by some kind of euphemisms or some kind of allusions and so on. So this is very often used in political psychology, in social psychology, to actually find out how linguistic means are used to structure the power relationships in society, or how do people who are prejudiced, or how do people who share a certain ideology, what kind of means do they use to impose this ideology on others. And in this approach, in this method, first you code discursive constructions, then you find out what are the contexts behind those, what are the allusions, what are the hints, and you try to understand what is the function of this text, what is the person trying to achieve, what is he or she trying to make us do with this text. So it is very often used to analyze the speeches of political leaders. And just as an old example coming from our country, a question to a political leader, so how are you going to work with people who do not accept you at all? And then he says, in general, all of our citizens must be treated with respect. There are, of course, people having passports of Russian citizens, but acting in the interests of foreign countries and with foreign money. With them, we shall also try to establish contacts. Often it is useless or impossible. What can one say in this case? You know what one can say at the end. Come to me, the Banderlock. I have loved Kipling since my childhood. And when you analyze this, you also split this text into little fragments. And in each fragment, you are trying to find out what are the discursive means that are used to create a certain effect. So, for example, the first phrase starts with "in general," and basically it starts with an idea that is impossible to disagree with. And then the second one includes "of course," where the person kind of says that there is no doubt that this is the case. And also in the third fragment, he introduces the us and them mentality. And in the fourth fragment, when he says that it's useless or impossible to establish contact with those people, the question is, what does he mean by useful? For whom? And then in the fifth fragment, he says, what can one say in this case? What can be said? And come to me, the Banderlock. I have loved Kipling since my childhood. And here we can also think about the allusions behind this metaphor of the Banderlock, because the Banderlock are monkey people. It's a whole bunch of monkeys who are completely stupid, and this smart snake basically hypnotizes them into submission. And this is the way the person, the speaker, actually represents his relationships with people who are them. And then you can generalize this and say that, of course, it's a vision of an us and them world where there are us and there are enemies. And it's impossible to have any dialogue with people who are not us. The only way to deal with them is to deceive and destroy them. And of course, then you can think of what are the consequences, what are the implications of this position. And unfortunately, we are now able to see this. There are also other qualitative methods. Narrative analysis, when a person is asked to describe a certain situation from their life as a narrative, which has a beginning and the end. And then you're trying to understand how this narrative evolves. Is it positive or negative? There are different ways to code it. Grounded theory, when you want to create a theory describing certain processes and you don't know what questions to ask, but you have some questions to start with. And you talk to different people taking part in this situation. And in this process, you refine your questions. And you make certain notes. And this is how you come up in the end with a theory. So in contrast to IPA, where you have a single list of questions and you're consistent, in grounded theory, you are learning in the process of interacting with your participants. And the authors of this method, there are chapters by Katie Charmas, and she describes how actually you can go about keeping those notes and dealing with those records, and how you come up from little categories to a single, integral, holistic theoretical description. Action research, when you're trying to understand something about a social context by trying to introduce some social change. And you are the actor, and in the process you talk to different participants, and you also write down your notes, and then you use it to understand something about this reality. So, for example, you come to a very old-fashioned traditional school, and you want to introduce some kind of well-being lessons. And then you talk to different people from this school, to teachers, to students, to the principals, to parents, to understand how they perceive this new course. And based on their perception, you can learn something about this old school atmosphere and how it can change. So this is not a final list. There are many other qualitative methods. And basically, when you want to choose a qualitative methods, just try to explore a little bit and think what is best given your data, given your type of research questions. Typically, the first 4 will be most likely to be your choice. But it's cool to experiment with grounded theory. I've never done it, but if you do it, it's a great idea. So in this part, we have discussed the different qualitative methods that exist in the literature. And the final little bit of our discussion will focus on how can we validate our results? How can we actually prove that our analysis is not rubbish, that is, it's not our projection, but it really allows us to get something from this data.